Purushottama Bilimoria from the Ashoka University, and his talking is about yogic perception, yogaja, pratyakṣa in Nyāya and Jainism. So you're welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be invited. Right now, actually, I'm in the University of Melbourne, and living outside Melbourne City in a very safe environment. So here I'm going to focus on two Indian schools, basically schools of Vedic philosophy, and in particular Nyāya and Jainism, which is really non-Vedic. I'm drawing from my earlier research on Yogic Perception, a joint paper was also on intuition that I did with Ananda Vaidya, who is going to be speaking after me, but on a different topic on Jainism. And Piotr Balcerowicz, a Jain scholar in Poland, as well as Jandra Soni, an Indian Jain scholar in Germany. Now, the term in the title, usually called yogaja, and variants in yogaja mana, yogaja gama, and in Jain apratyakṣa or arshagyana, really means produced or arising from yoga or contemplation. It could also be analytic thinking or application of other exercises that Dr. Resnick just pointed out in his talk. Shortened to yogi, and in English, yogic. This could be rendered as intuition, or as yogic pratyakṣa is said to be alaukika, that is transcendental in the phenomenological sense, in Jain epistemology at least, and it is connected with omniscience and mystical knowing. So the core debate is over whether yogaja pratyakṣa, hereafter YP, is a pramana, that is, a validly accredited means of cognition, either as a standalone means of knowing or as an extension of one of the recognized pramanas reductively. It is, however, usually aligned with perception and inference, but sometimes also with testimony, which are conduits for this special perception. In other words, the core question is the following: is yogic perception a means of acquiring knowledge about something? Two schools, the exegetical Mimamsaka, which is a sort of a hermeneutical school, ritualist school, and the materialist Charvaka, argue that it is not. The remaining 8, along with Jain, argue that it is. The Buddhists tend to waver. That's not the topic that I'll cover here. However, the schools that accept YP disagree over exactly how the particular mental state is an instrument of knowledge, what its fundamental nature is, and so forth. So, there are at least two different understandings of YP. On this person-based model of YP, a perception is said to be extraordinary because of the kinds of things that it is about, and because of the nature of person that can have such a perception. YP entails the multi-phase sensory perception that the yogin is capable of. A yogin is also called a yukta, one absorbed in continual samadhi state or contemplation, and viyukta, or a kevalin, in a state of emptiness or bereft of all conceptual cognitive content, in other words, separated from the mundane world, the mundane realities. In addition to cognizing particulars, entities, qualias, events in the ordinary order of things, the yogin has cultivated the higher capacity of perceiving universals as the property of sameness, samanya, that is the second order universal of universals, which is knowledge of even more special kind. There may even be a separate third order perception that embeds a distinct knowledge of the categories of sameness of modal universals, substantives, property substantives, and timeless events, unattached to any particulars, events, or natural kinds. The knowledge of infinite expansive self, omniscience, liberation, the summum bonum, or nishriya would be 4 instances of the extraordinary supernovae. To elaborate on the trope of sameness of universals a little further, I'll cite a couplet from the celebrated Nyāya text, Bhāṣa Parisheda. Alokika astu vyapara trividaha parikirtathaha samanya lakshana, jnana lakshana, yogajastha. Now, the text here speaks of three operational conjuncts: in ordinary cognition, mind with its object of awareness; in the case of extraordinary perception, namely ones based on common features, samanya, and those based on knowledge that arise from yoga or concentration. So it's only in the third that we get to something close to mystical. But in the second one, it's still very much analytical. A word on the use of vyapara or conjunct is appropriate here. In early Nyāya, this was simply called sanikarsha, that is sense organ contact. But because the mind, which perhaps in the Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere in Sankhya would be called buddhi, but that's not how it is understood exactly in Nyāya. It's very much a material faculty, certainly, but close enough to how brain is understood in Western post-Cartesian philosophy of mind. Because the mind, a sense organ in an Aristotelian sense of a sensus communis, perhaps we might even call it a sixth sense, technically the operational feature of conjunct is preferred. And its fitting object is, in the first modality, samanya lakshana. Lakshana being the structure of cognition, sameness is a common generic feature. So this common characteristic may cut across a number of substantive occurrences. So it is not just samanya as jati, natural kind universals or real universals, or even nominal universals, or smokeness in seeing smoke bellowing from the lorry fire or from the stove. But the association of this smokeness to all instances of smokeness and smoky things generically, remembered, portended, or predicted, or otherwise. In other words, it is not attached to the material instance of wood burning, right? So this is what is said to be critical here. This hypergeneric coordinate is the conjunct in the cognition. What one cognizes is a substantive sameness of the feature of smoke across a number of instantiations. So there is a conjunct, sure, but it's not with the material object entity. The second modality is with respect to this decisive knowledge of that sameness is being possessed by such as a substantive, smokeness to smoke. The text seems to emphasize that there is a separate connection that is being made between seeing smokeness and the second order knowledge that these features of these are features of smoke. So it could be, the conjunct could be internally in the mind itself or with memory. It doesn't have to be with things outside in the world. Otherwise, there would be no connection of the sameness in seeing smoke in the kitchen and seeing smoke at a distance when there is fire on the mountain. So this is the special conjunct the mind achieves with respect to something as simple as the presence of smoke in place K and then in a place M. Nyāya considered this function of the mind that knows smoke by knowing the connection based on common features to be somehow extraordinary. Nothing here is said about the knowledge of the object as such that possesses smoke, for recall the definition is directed at knowing through the limits of lakshana, that is the phenomenology of the cognition of universals. This applies better to fire, which is non-material and has spirit form at least in the Vaisheshika ontology, which precedes the Nyāya philosophy of categories. The third operational modality is with respect to yoga, whereby concentration aided by meditation and an accomplished yogi is able to have knowledge of every sameness, hence universal and universal of universals, and everything that could possibly or modally be connected with these universals. Okay, so in fact, a highly attained or enlightened yogi is said to be always connected with the knowledge of substantives in all possible worlds, and thereby with everything that there is to know. Yuktasya sarvada. The yukta does not have to know each and every individual thing, which indeed is not a requirement of omniscience as generally understood. And furthermore, it follows that the last part of the claim here blocks the skeptic's doubt or question. How does one know that one knows everything? It suffices that there is virtual connection to the knowledge of universals and the overarching universals, the arche, etc. So on the universal-based model of EP, extraordinary perception, a model of EP, a perception, therefore, is said to be extraordinary because it involves an ordinary sensory connection to something, a universal, which is extraordinary because when one is appropriately connected to the universal by a sensory connection, they are through the nature of universals, also connected to all prior and future instances of the universal. And so Samanya Lakshana Pratyakṣa means universal-based sensory connection. As Das tells us, the yogin can perceive the subtle objects, atoms, minds of others, air, space, time through this perception. Jayanta Bhatta, a later Nyāya, describes yogic perception as a perception of subtle, hidden, remote, past, and future objects and considers it to be the highest excellence of human perception. And he rejoins that the yogin perceives all objects in all places through cognition simultaneously. So what they're trying to do is actually perhaps give a yogic, or rather an analytic account of how we know both universals, universal of universals, and things that are not perceptible, that are not presented to our cognition right in front of us. Now, I don't know what they were smoking, soma, ganja, on the banks of the Ganga in Varanasi or ayahuasca, but they seem to be onto something. So the core account of intuition on the personal-based model of EP is that intuition is a form of supernormal perception, a kind of perception where one's normal perceptual capacities are enhanced so as to allow one to intuit the past and the future, subtle things, elusive things, imperceptible traces of entities and events receded in time, and even remote entities or events that are not presented to us. Of course, one might simply ask, how can the mind make contact with future objects or events decisively elusive or adrushta? Here it is interesting to note that the Nyāya do not hold that intuition requires contact. Rather, they hold that the supernormal overall state of the mind is sufficient to generate the intuition, because the mind is in a supernormal state, such that it can deliver the intuition that have elements that are about the past, about the future, about entities that are remote or hidden. So the form of contact here is called samyukta samyoga shanikarsha, a presentification, literally the transcendental conjunct of the noesis with its intentional sameness, the noeta outside, as we described in the instances of grasping of universals. So when Walter Benjamin talked of walking back from the future, he was having some yogic intuition for sure. He only otherwise spoke a European gentleman's pipe. In that sense, one could say that yogaja pratyakṣa embeds a transsensory cognition for the mind, while it is atomic, but as it piggybacks on Atman, or the soul, it is said to be vibhu, or has extension. So we're talking of extended mind throughout the body, certainly, and as the sixth sense faculty far-reaching outwardly, and hence the phenomenal access has phenomenal access to elusive objects. So this is how it's to be understood. This implies that the mind extends beyond its ordinary capabilities to reach out in multi-phase, beyond the Kantian bounds of senses, and registers a knowing, jnana grahaka, in the non-constraining epistemic environment. And it is in Descartes, the clear light of mind, which beams out of the soul, becomes one with God's supreme knowledge or overarching bliss, ananda. So this, in brief, then is the phenomenology of yoga pratyakṣa in Nyāya. Hence, in regard to yoga pratyakṣa, it is both extraordinary and transsensory, which Stephen Phillips elsewhere has christened, in the sense of Krishna, this uniquely as mystical empiricalism. So interesting coinage, mystical empiricalism. All right, so now to the jhana position, the second half. As Jayendra Soni explains, jhana thinkers did not lag behind in their concern with epistemological issues. Human beings can gain knowledge of ultimate reality, are in a position to be omniscient through strict ascetic disciplines. They attain kevala jnana, enlightened freedom. So it's not something that you just go from ordinary perception to an extraordinary perception. It requires discipline and so forth. Unique to Jainism is the idea that the direct knowledge, in fact, takes place through the soul. On the basis of the twofold classification of direct and indirect means of knowledge, an intricate theory of knowledge is built up concerning the fundamental principles or categories, tattvas. In the Pravanachara Sara, it explains, the soul is coextensive with knowledge. Knowledge is said to be coextensive with the object of knowledge. The object of knowledge comprises the physical and non-physical world. Therefore, knowledge is omnipresent. When the Jains speak about a knowledge of objects, they mean specifically knowledge of 7 categories that comprise the metaphysics of the school. The 7 categories are, as Umasawati mentions them in the Tattva-artha Sutra, the sentient and insentient categories, the inflow of matter into the soul. Matter turns into karmic particles. We're familiar with the theory of karma, so it becomes karmic, dark particles, which obstruct the innate energy of the soul. And so bondage arises caused by this inflow, and there is stoppage or obstacle of further inflow. Now, the burning away of the remaining particles of karma through asceticism leads to liberation as a result of being isolated from the influence of matter, hence Kevala. The question arises, what are the means of pramana here? For direct knowledge, for indirect knowledge, it is the sensory modality of the mind as the instrument getting in touch with the objects outside. For Umaswati, however, the direct perception, which takes place in the soul, which is classified as more extraordinary or that falls under EP, unlike indirect knowledge, occurs through clairvoyance, telepathy, and omniscience, while sensory knowledge and scriptural knowledge are indirect. Divine and infernal beings possess extraordinary, or rather extrasensory knowledge, such as clairvoyance. Now, if the karma that hinders this kind of knowledge is obliterated or neutralized, then animals and human beings too can have that. And through it, all entities that have form can be known. Then there is telepathy, which is of 2 kinds, distinguished on the basis of purity and infallibility, and its range is infinitely greater than that of clairvoyance. The scope of omniscience, on the other hand, extends to all substances in all their modes simultaneously. Sensory knowledge, scriptural knowledge, and clairvoyance can also run into errors, so be warned. In Jainism, the correlation between supernatural perception and omniscience became most conspicuous and pronounced. However, in Balsarovich's reading, some Jain scholars treated yogic pratyakṣa as an intermediate state to ultimate perfection of knowledge, that is, to omniscience. They did not collapse the two. Let us expand on these qualifications. This is how Piotr explains direct perception and the relation between the 3 modalities within it. It's somewhat technical, but worth citing. The heading of direct cognition proper comprised 3 varieties of what one could call supernormal perception, rather supernatural perception, with no intermediary of sense organs or minds, conceived of as quasi-sense organ, very much as the Nyāyakas considered mind to be a 6th sense organ. Clairvoyance, however, traditionally comes first. It was believed to grasp material microscopic objects that were considered physically beyond the reach of ordinary sensuous perception or testimonial cognition. Further, this kind of extrasensory perception was not accessible to everyone. One had to either be born with it, that is, be in the DNA, or to acquire it through special ascetic practices. In terms of cognitive faculties, we can speak of 2 kinds of clairvoyance: clairvoyant perception and clairvoyant knowledge. However, it is also twofold in terms of its origin. It's conditioned by birth, that is, possessed by the denizens of hell and divine beings as well, because they carry it in the astral bodies. Occasioned by destruction, subsistence of karma, and so forth. The Jains further distinguish 6 varieties of it: not accompanying, that is present only in a given place, so temporal. It accompanies the person after he or she has left the place where he or she obtained it, regressive or oscillating, and stable, that is the person until the moment of death or attainment. So it's temporal, so you lose it after you lose the place, but the second one, you can take it to wherever you go, and third, it stays with you forever when liberation or omniscience is obtained. It is continued. Balsarovich continues, much subtler than telepathy or mind reading. Manaprayaya is the direct grasp of other person's thoughts, that is, all contents of other minds. through a process of spiritual development and cultivation of best virtues, but available only to morally most advanced human beings. The difference between clairvoyance and telepathy concerned clarity, place, possessor, and domain. Thus, only telepathy was believed to be restricted to the restrained or spiritually advanced human beings, which it was conditioned by high moral standards. The apex of all spiritual and cognitive development, however, as well as the fulfillment of the dream of the imperfect suffering living being, was the absolute perfect knowledge or omniscience, Kevala. From the Jain standpoint, omniscient perfect beings, Kevalins, perception faced no spatial, temporal, or structural limitations, and literally everything was revealed through it all at once. The past, present, and future, distant and sublime, material and mental. Unlike in Buddhism, omniscience in Jainism was conceived not as some kind of potentia available only to perfected beings, but is a cognitive actuality. The attainment of the absolute knowledge is the consummation of mundane existence of the soul, transmigrating from time immemorial onto liberation, and that too without God, because Jainism is basically atheistic. So it's a connection with the mind's own potential powers, which is inherent in the soul, then is contact with or blessings or grace of a being such as God. Of course, the Nyāya and the Jain views on ESP, now I'm calling it ESP, extrasensory perception, met with vehement criticism, mostly from materialists, the ritualists, Mimamsakas, and some Buddhists also. The Mimamsakas led the counter-argument that there was lack of evidence, for it is not possible to formulate any rational proof of supersensory perception. What is the proof of supernormal perception that could also cognize dharma? Dharma being the order of things, or the right thing to do in the order of things. What knowledge could be greater than knowing dharma, which should only be known through scriptures as far as the Mimamsakas are concerned, not through intuition? Rationalists like Richard Dawkins would ask that of the yogis, gurus, godmen, godkeepers, psychics and new ages, theosophists and soothsayers who believe in the powers of telepathy, clairvoyance, and perhaps human omniscience, and make careers out of selling these dubious pramanas. What evidence do you have, or what rather scientific were secretly engaged in the Cold War years, exploring the potential of using ESP to spy on each other. It would be cheaper than the expensive zooming in satellites and the interspace wars. Apparently, the Russians made quite a headway, but then gave up. Maybe we could sell them some Nyāya and Jain texts. Well, the good news I shall end with autobiographically, not that I'm a yogin, is that the Russian Indian philosophers secured a $1.8 million mega grant and sought me out hiding in here in this forest of Venus Bay, and to have me as the lead scientist for a lab in Indian philosophy to develop methodologies for greater understanding Indian epistemology, ontology, and ethic. And I think this will be quite an experiment and an adventure. And I look forward to doing further research on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you for quite interesting aspect of Indian epistemology and logic, that there is a new kind of perception, yogic perception.
Right.
And and my not question but rather a commentary is as follows. This notion, yogaja, pratyakṣa, occurs in the Yogacara treatises also. And in my opinion, the logic in India was rather for the yoga practice than for something else. For example, in the Yogacara books, it is very evident that the logic was established rather for classifying dharmas, for abhidharma, and we see that even notions dharma and dharmin, just to show for what this machine was founded. And so my commentary is as follows, that the Indian logic, Nyāya, is rather for something other than the Western logic. It is rather for our epistemology and for our yoga practice. Maybe you reaction to my comments.
Yes, I think that's pretty good. If I had time to make some commentaries, I would say that, you know, in Nyāya, as you point out in Yogacara, and perhaps in Abhidharma as well, that they're using this as an expansion of the epistemology. So this is part of the logic of the expansion of the epistemology, and this will come out even a bit more in the Jain context in the next talk by Dr. Ananda Vaidya. And you know, this is really not in a way, at least for Nyāya, you know, in indulgence in something that's just, you know, completely outside of epistemology, or in, you know, some kind of a pure mystical pursuit. Now, I mean, if that were the case, you know, I wouldn't be speaking here today, and I wouldn't be writing on this either. And nor would people like, you know, Jayanta Bhatta or Narayana Bhatta, you know, the authors of Bhasha Parisheda, because I think they were very, very committed to trying to expand epistemology. So what do we know? We know things directly through our sense contact with objects, but objects aren't the only things out there. There are universals, there are things, and there are things that are in the past which are not immediately present to us. There are things in people's minds which, you know, may not be present to us, and there are things in the future that haven't happened yet, right? But there are still, in a sense, things. There are things in the world. So how do we know these things, and how would we go about classifying that kind of knowledge? So, you know, if we're going to know everything, and Nyāya certainly believes that we can know everything that there is to know, we can name everything that there is to be known, then we can't just limit our knowledge to, you know, the in scientific terms, the observables, right? Even though, you know, mathematical entities and non-existent entities in the Manongian sense are not material entities, but we do know them somehow, you know. And so I think this is really where the thrust of the epistemological, the epistemic quest was. So thank you. Yeah, that's a very good comment. Perhaps there's some question.
Thank you. I see that there are no other comments. So thank you so much for your talking. It is very impressive. So thank you.